مساء الخير.
مساء النور.
أهلا وسهلا فيكم جميعا، وأهلا بكم في أمسية اليوم الثاني من مهرجان الأدب الفلسطيني كلمات. كلمات بيقدم 14 كاتب وكاتبة محليين وعالميين، ويقام على فترة 5 أيام ما بين 3 ل 7 نوفمبر تشرين الثاني في مدن فلسطينية عدة، ابتداء بالقدس ونابلس ورام الله وبيت لحم وختاما بحيفا. ويتضمن إقامة ورشات عمل للكتاب في جامعات فلسطينية مختلفة. نحن القائمين على المهرجان نأمل أن يكون هو فضاء من خلاله يتم الاحتفال بالثقافة بجميع أشكالها وشكلياتها، وخلق مساحة للنقاش وتبادل الأفكار. الكتابة بجميع أشكالها هي وسيلة للوصول لعدد أكبر من الحضور في البيئة الغير محيطة بالدرجة الأولى، وهي طريقة أساسية للتعبير عن النفس والاعتراض على الأوضاع السيئة المحيطة، وخاصة للأشخاص والشعوب التي تقبع تحت الظلم وقيود عدم الحرية كما هو الحال هنا في فلسطين. وبالتالي يرفض المهرجان الأدب الفلسطيني كلمات قرار سلطات الاحتلال الإسرائيلية بمنع سوزان أبو الهوى من الدخول للمشاركة في المهرجان. سوزان وصلت وقضت أكثر من 32 ساعة واحتجزت في مطار بن غوريون، ومن خلال هدول 32 ساعة حاولت ترفض وتعترض على قرار سلطات الاحتلال بالمنع، ولكن دون جدوى. زي ما احنا بنعرف انه الاحتلال بيستعمل القوانين الواهية والحجج الضعيفة لعدم إدخال ناشطين سياسيين زي سوزان، بس احنا بنأكد انه احنا نقف الى جنبها وساعدناها، وراح نضل نساعدها كمهرجان في انها تدخل في مرة قادمة او في مهرجانات، في المهرجان الجاي او اللي بعده، وانها تكون جزء من هذا المهرجان. بحب كمان اشكر الداعمين للمهرجان اللي هم المجلس البريطاني البريتش كونسل، المكتب الألماني فريدريش ستيفتنج، والمهرجان أو المنظمين للمهرجان هم الإديوكيشنال بوك شوب المكتب العلمية في القدس، والكانيون انستيتيوت في القدس اللي هو مركز الأبحاث البريطاني. كمان بحب أشكر نصير عرفات اللي كان له دور كبير في تنسيق للكتاب اليوم ولنا في جولة في نابلس، وكمان هو لعمله في القسم الثقافي في نابلس وفي القدس ومشاركته فيه، وهو كان له دور كثير مهم في إنجاح هذا المهرجان كمان. مع إنه الحضور اليوم متواضع، ولكن إحنا كثير سعيدين بوجودكم. إحنا طبعاً كجزء من المهرجان كمان بنحب إنه يكون المهرجان موجود في مدن فلسطينية أساسية، ومن ضمنها نابلس طبعا كنوع من التشجيع والدعم لهاي البلد، وإنه يكون المهرجان شمولي وفي كل مكان. معنا اليوم مجموعة من الكتاب المحليين والعالميين. دكتور نور مصالحة رح يكون نطلب منك تدير اللقاء. عندنا كمان سعاد العامري، مايا أبو الحياة، مارسيلو دي تشينتو، وكيفن فرانسيس. راح أحكي بس بصورة كتير سريعة، أعطيكم شوية معلومات عنهم وبعدين نقدر ننتقل أو نبدأ الأمسية. نور مصالحة كاتب ومؤرخ فلسطيني الأصل، كتب العديد من الكتب عن فلسطين والتاريخ الشفوي والهوية المجتمعية، كما كتب عن التوراة والصهيونية وأيضا عن تاريخ القدس. كتابه الأخير فلسطين 4000 عام من التاريخ. عضو في مركز الدراسات الفلسطينية في مدرسة الدراسات الشرقية والأفريقية التابعة لجامعة لندن، وهو محرر مجلة الأرض المقدسة ودراسات فلسطين. مارسيلو دي تشينتو مؤلف وصحفي كندي. في أحدث كتبه لا تكترث بالصواريخ Pay no heed to the rockets in English، يستكشف الحياة اليومية في فلسطين من خلال عدسة الثقافة والأدب الفلسطيني. أما في كتابه السابق في فلسطين الجدار، رحلات عن جانبي المتراس، فاز بالجائزة الأولى في مسابقة تشانيزي كوهن للكتابات السياسية. سعاد العامري، كاتبة ومهندسة معمارية فلسطينية، مؤسسة ومديرة مركز المعمار الشعبي رواق في رام الله. كتبت يومياتها شارون وحماتي في عام 2014 وفازت بالعديد من الجوائز العالمية، منها جائزة فيرغو فارسيلا، وترجم الكتاب إلى أكثر من 19 لغة. كما كتبت أيضا كتاب سن اليأس الفلسطيني، نساء على الحافة، جولدا نامت هنا، وكتابها الأخير ماي دمسكوس دمشقي، اللي أنا استمتعت كثير في قراءته. كيفن فرانسيس. Gavin. Sorry, Gavin.
I answered to Kevin.
جافن فرانسيس، كاتب وطبيب اسكتلندي، حاز على جائزة اسكتلندا الأولى وجائزة الكتاب العلمي والعديد من الجوائز الأخرى لكتابه مغامرات في الإنسان، وترجم إلى أكثر من 17 لغة عالمية. كتابه الأخير مغيري الشكل عن الطب وتغيير الإنسان، يلقي الضوء على التغيرات في العقل والجسد كأحد أهم التغيرات في أوجه كينونة الإنسان. ماينا أبو الحياة، شاعرة وكاتبة من مواليد بيروت، تعيش حاليا في القدس. نشرت 3 دواوين شعرية والعديد من الكتب، تحديدا 4 كتب، منها لا أحد يعرف زمرة دمه. تدير ورشة فلسطين للكتابة، وهي مؤسسة تشجع على القراءة والكتابة في المجتمع الفلسطيني من خلال مشاريع ودورات كتابة إبداعية، إضافة إلى أسلوب الحكواتي بين الأطفال ومعلميهم. نرجو منكم إنكم تحيوهم تحية نابلسية. وبدي أعطي المايك للأستاذ نور عشان نبلش. بحب أذكركم كمان إنه الكتب كلها موجودة برا لكل الكتاب، إذا أي حدا بحب يشتريهم، وأكيد الكتاب بيقدروا يوقعوا له إياهم الليلة. شكرا.
شكرا يا أحمد. مساء الخير وأهلا وسهلا بكم. أنا أستاذ فلسطيني عايش في البيت خالص لمدة طويلة حوالي 200 سنة. بس إنه باجي كثير هنا، وبقولوا إنه أصلاً إحنا من منطقة نابلس، يعني بيحكوا إنه المصالحة تركوا منطقة نابلس بالقرن ال18 وراحوا سكنوا بالجليل تحت حكم ظاهر العمر. الظاهر كان في طوشة في قرية في منطقة نابلس، والمصالحة عاملين شغل مش يعني مضبوطة، وطلعوهم من البلد وكحشوا يعني صفينا في الجليل، عايشين في الجليل كعائلة وكحمولة. فيعني في له ضلع في نابلس شوية، مش كثير. أنا حكيت كثير امبارح، وبطبيعتي المحاضرين بيحكوا كثير يعني، وكمان حكيت اليوم في جامعة النجاح عن التاريخ الشفوي الفلسطيني وعن الفلسطينيين. فاليوم بدي اختصرها، وبس بدي اذكر الكتب الجديدة اللي نشرتها، منها كتاب المتحدثين تاعونا. Our speakers tonight are going to be split between speaking Arabic and speaking English. I think I'm going to give the choice to use this. So we are going to use 2 languages, but for the audience, you can speak in Arabic, you can ask questions in Arabic. So it's going to be free, but we have 2 distinguished speakers who are non-Arabic speakers, and therefore we need to also to be proud of our language, but also open to the world. Without further ado, I'm going to ask Saad, a distinguished author. I don't think you need to be introduced actually. One of my favorite books actually, My Damascus. I think this book actually has become quite widely read. And Saad is actually probably one of our best authors now in Palestine. One of our best authors.
Just because I'm sitting next to you.
I think let me give you some compliments actually about it. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Saad to kick off this debate within the theme of breaking boundaries. كسر الحدود، كسر الحواجز، تخطي الحواجز، يعني ممكن واحد ترجمها من بالأساس من الناحية الإبداعية، creatively, intellectually, mentally. That's a big thing. It's all yours.
Thank you so much. أحكي بالعربي ولا بالإنجليزي؟ مين إذا حكيت بالإنجليزي ما بعرف، ما بفهم.
Who doesn't speak English?
طيب ومين إذا حكيت بالعربي ما بفهم؟
We've got about 4, 5, 6 people who don't speak Arabic here.
طب أحكي بالإنجليزي للعرب معلش أحكي بالإنجليزي مشانهم. It's okay with you?
تفضل.
أوكي طيب يلا مشان إذا في عندنا كمان two writers ونحكي المسبات بالعربي والأشياء الجديدة بالإنجليزي. طيب اليوم الحقيقة اللقاء should be speaking in English. Since you talked about your connection to Nablus, maybe I should do the same. Those of you who haven't read my Damascus, my teta is from Nablus, or from Arabi. And my teta, my grandmother always had a grudge about Nablus because the Nablusis, even though the Abdelhadis lived in Nablus for the last 200 years at least, they are still considered fallahin. مظبوط ولا لا? They're still considered peasants. So I have a grudge also because my grandmother, even though the Abdelhadis have been here for so many centuries, you still don't consider them. That's why I decided to speak in English today. Okay, come to the subject. We were asked actually to talk about pushing the boundaries, whatever that meant. And for me, as an architect, the first pushing of a border actually is changing my profession from being an architect into becoming a writer. So that by itself is a change of a lifestyle completely. One thing I always say, Adish, do I have 2 hours to speak? Or
you have 13 and a half minutes.
Okay. Because nobody who knows me put me the first one because there will not be time for anybody else to speak. But anyway, the one thing actually I never thought I will be in my life is a writer. I must tell you this. When I was a little girl, I spoke so much. I was a hakawati that my mother used to time me and say, Saad, you've been talking. Susu, you have been talking for 2 hours. Shut up. Actually, I am dyslexic, so I didn't know that I was dyslexic until I was in the university. Nobody discovered because I was so talkative and so outgoing that nobody noticed that I was handicapped, actually, that I read very slowly. And so I thought, my father used to say, you have to become a lawyer or a judge because you speak so much and the judge would be so bored with you, you will win all the cases. And my mother said, just go out and, be on stage, do whatever you want. So what I really wanted to be is go in nature and be with animals. We had a little zoo at the home, that's what I wanted to do. But because I am dyslexic, I wanted to study agriculture. By mistake, I went to the architecture department and I studied architecture. And this is how I became an architect. All of you who know me, if you ask about Saad in Palestine, they will know the Saad the architect. Nobody would ever know Saad the writer. And I came to become a writer by pure accident, really pure accident, when the Israelis occupied Ramallah. I was fortunate to have my mother-in-law to come and live with me for 40 days, and I ended up with 2 occupations, as I always say, one inside the house, which is my mother-in-law, and one side outside, which is Sharon's army. And this is how I wrote Sharon and my mother-in-law. So this is the first pushing of the boundaries, changing my profession. Now, as a writer, what does it really mean to push the boundaries? From Sharon, because I became a writer by pure accident, and Sharon and my mother-in-law had become maybe the most successful book. I always thought that the reader actually, pushing the border for the reader is meaning 2 things. In the case of Palestine, I discovered, all from my Sharon and my mother-in-law, that pushing the border in Sharon and my mother-in-law meant that we Palestinians should stop talking about the collective issue. We have bored the world by talking about losing Palestine. What does it mean really to lose a country? How do people relate to us by losing a country? We have always shied away from telling a personal story. I found out from Sharon and my mother-in-law that my dog Noura had done more to Palestine than myself. The story of Noura and her Hawiyya, her Jerusalem Hawiyya. I found out that just because I pushed the border, the hero in this case was a dog. And you know, dogs are not very popular in the Arab world. Pushing the border of talking Hamati. I didn't have any heroes. Actually, all my heroes in Sharon and my mother-in-law were either a dog, or a collaborator, or a woman that had an affair with the neighbor, or my mother-in-law who drove me crazy. So I realized that really the reader appreciates when you don't have heroes in your books. You don't do, the book is not romantic. I described the way my husband proposed to me. It was the most unromantic story you can ever hear. So I really realized that the reader wants something which is pushing the border in the sense that done the unexpected. In my case, I found out that just by joking, actually, and making fun of myself and everybody, is another way of pushing, because the reader, when you read about Palestine, you're supposed to do what? Cry. What if I made you laugh? So that's another pushing of a border when you use humor and when you make people laugh when they're supposed to be crying, or actually when they are crying, you're supposed to make them laugh. So again, I think that one as a writer can push the border by also not having personalities that are good and bad. Everybody, you know, you have this character that is beautiful, this man is tall and kind and does everything right. I don't have none of this in my stories. None of them are actually, they're mostly cattive, as the Italians say. They're mostly aggressive and they're mostly not very kind, like my mother-in-law. So often I find out that as a writer, I really need to push the border by the characters, but also in my case, because I became a writer by pure accident by Sharon and my mother-in-law, I tried to push the border by changing the way I write and the topic in which I write. None of my books actually is similar to the other, or the stories is similar to the other. The last one, I decided enough Palestine. I want to go to my Syrian side, which is my mother's side. That's how I ended up with my Damascus. So in my case, but for me, pushing the border really means that I have to spend, I don't believe in inspiration in writing, I must tell you. I'm never sitting there and an idea comes to me by inspiration. The only time I push the border is by sitting. You can only do writing by writing. In other words, I only write, the longer I sit to write, the better the writing is. I don't know, I would love to hear from my real writers, because I always consider myself a pseudo-writer that came to this field, and I always, for the longest time, I felt nervous being around writers, but now I have all the confidence. Really, I don't believe in inspiration in writing, and I die to hear other writers. I'm going to stop here because I would like to hear others and hope we have another chance, another round of doing things. Okay?
It's a great beginning. Well, it's a brilliant start to the evening. Keep in mind questions to Saad till the end, okay? And I do want you to push Saad also, okay? On the question of a writer by accident, but I think we will move on to our next speaker, our distinguished speaker from Canada, Marcello. His book is, well, the book I know is actually Pay No Heed to the Rockets, which is a title from a line taken from a poem by Mahmoud Darwish, if you know the poem. And I think Marcello actually will talk more about himself and about his other book also. By the way, this book, as well as Suad's book, is outside for you to to pick up and buy and read.
Just buy 2 copies from mine, 1 from his.
That's fair.
Okay, so if you don't mind, I do want to flog these books, to sell them tonight, not to go home without selling them. And I think I'll let Marcel actually represent himself rather than me representing him.
Thank you very much. I got to tell you, being a non-Palestinian who wrote about Palestine, talking about Palestine in Palestine is makes me incredibly anxious, just considering who else is on this table and in the audience as well. But I think my greatest emotion now is gratitude. I'm so excited to be here to share my book and share a week with these other wonderful writers. It's fantastic. This is my 10th visit, I believe, to Palestine, and I've long wanted to write I've written smaller things about Palestine. There was a chapter in my last book about the wall around the West Bank. I've written a few magazine pieces, but I've long wanted to write a book-length work about the Palestinians. But the reason is, and this is the barrier I think that I'm trying to break, is too often in my part of the world, we only see the Palestinian in relation to the conflict and struggle and the occupation. The Palestinian as a character there's only 2 kinds. We have the Palestinian, the young man with the keffiyeh over his face throwing the stones at the soldiers, or the older woman in hijab kind of on her knees wailing in front of about a destroyed home. The Palestinian in my part of the world is only ever represented by the victim or the militant. This is it. And I really wanted to find a way to write about Palestinians and find different stories to tell, stories that we're not told, we don't hear in Canada or maybe in the West in general, at least not enough. So I thought, what better way to if I wanted to look for new stories, who better to go to than the storytellers themselves? So I returned to Palestine and I met with poets and writers and novelists and short story writers and librarians and booksellers. Several people in this room, including one on this table, appears in my book. It was a remarkable opportunity that I had to spend sometimes hours sitting across the table in a cafe, watching Palestinian poets smoke endless cigarettes, or joining Maya in Ramallah Cafe and watching her smoke nargila over and over, and get to hear people's stories that, while they are certainly alongside and affected or infected by conflict and occupation constantly, at least they came from a different starting point. I found it very kind of freeing, I guess, that I could start I could start conversation with the Palestinians I met by, instead of asking them about being humiliated at checkpoint, I can start by saying, "What's the first poem you wrote?" Instead of asking about tell me about the olive fields your grandfather lost in the Nakba, I can ask instead, "Tell me about your grandfather's library." So the conversation could start a different way. They started with literature and art and beauty instead of with the opposite. Certainly, politics came up. You know, those conversations inevitably led to conversations about occupation, but at least it could start from a different space. So for the book, I traveled to, like I said, I met Palestinian writers here. I went to Gaza for a couple months. I visited briefly to Beirut to get the stories, the human stories of these remarkable people. And I'm going to link it to Nablus as well too. One of the things I discovered as I was looking for these stories, that sometimes it wasn't just the stories of the Palestinians; it was the stories of the books themselves. That books and libraries and bookstores had a story to them in the same way that the authors of said books had a story to them. And one of the places I had the opportunity to visit was here in Nablus, the Municipal Library. And some of you may know that I think the second or third floor of the library, there's a special room set aside for books that were collected from 2 prisons that were shut down after Oslo, Junaid and the Nablus prison. So, when those prisons were shut down, all the books were collected into one space, and there's one room now in the library that holds them. I kind of learned about this library from a former prisoner who was a writer who wrote a memoir of his life, and it was Wissam Rafidi. Some may know him, and so I'm going to read a little bit from the book from after I meet and talk to Wissam, and he tells me about the library here in Nablus. I decided to go visit it. After speaking to Wissam, I went to see the prisoners' library in Nablus. Two Palestinian sisters, Bisan and Zaina Ramadan, took me to the third-floor room in the municipal library, which houses about 8,000 printed books and 800 notebooks from Nablus and Junayd prisons. Most of the inmates in these prisons would have been jailed for their role in the First Intifada, and a large number of titles discussed Marxism and socialist economics. These are the same books Wissam and his PFLP colleagues would have read, studied, and copied during their incarcerations. Other books describe the struggles of subjugated people elsewhere in the world. The Palestinian movement has always felt connected to other independence movements, especially during the 1960s and 70s, Wissam said. I found an account of America's destruction of its native peoples and a workbook dedicated to Namibian independence. I also found a tattered book of songs about Nelson Mandela, himself a prisoner at the time, with both English and Arabic translations. Someone had written diacritical marks in pencil over the Arabic lyrics to indicate proper pronunciation, evidence that the prisoners did not simply read the words, but sang them aloud. Many political prisoners of the time were students who wanted to keep up with their studies while in prison, Bisan said, hence the large section of textbooks and dictionaries. Prisoners who had been educated abroad gave foreign language lessons to their fellow inmates. A shelf of English fiction held the sort of classics high school teachers assigned to their students. Titles by Dickens, Hardy, and Hemingway stood alongside the occasional spy thriller or English translations of Dostoevsky and Mahfouz. There were unexpected selections too, such as the biography of Picasso and the Burl Ives songbook. Elsewhere in the library, I browsed a selection of English nonfiction, most dedicated to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, with titles like The West Bank and the Rule of Law and Israeli Nuclear Deterrence. Others like Silent Spring and Crime in America cast a dark light on the United States government. The fact that the prisoners were allowed a library at all is itself a victory. In the 1960s, decades before Wissam's long incarcerations, the Israelis did not allow prisoners to have books. Inmates staged hunger strikes to demand them. The authorities eventually relented and began to cooperate with the Red Cross to allow selected books into the prison. Many remained banned, especially political titles, and everything had to be approved by prison officials. Nonetheless, inmates' families smuggled in forbidden books by adding false covers and changing the first few pages so that the volumes would pass a casual inspection by guards. This library stands as an accomplishment of the prisoners' movement, Bisan said. Each book means someone had to suffer inside the prison. This is real struggle. The end of the Cold War and the years preceding Oslo also left an ideological hole in the Palestinian project, as the socialist independence movement suddenly found themselves aimless and without a core philosophy. In Palestine, as elsewhere, the left left. Even Wissam, who maintains that socialism could be a solution for the Palestinian struggle, admits that the Soviet model is dead. Political Islam stepped up and filled the ideological space that socialism left behind. Compared to what came next, the violent excesses of the Second Intifada, the rise of religious extremism, infighting among Palestinian factions, the First Intifada seemed the golden age of Palestinian resistance. The fighters have been cast as heroes, as better men fighting a more dignified and honorable fight. This is why their books are so important. For visitors to the library, like Bisan and Zaina, the books provide a tactile link to the prisoners and the time in which they lived. Nobody visits the library to read these books. They come to connect with the men who once held them. Bisan and Zaina's father, Mahmoud, was himself imprisoned in Junayd's first political beliefs. He read many of these books, and he told his daughters that if they searched the volumes carefully, they might find his handwriting in the margins. "This is what I'm looking for," Zaina told me. "This is part of who I am." As she flipped through books she guessed her father might have read, Zaina showed me some of the writing other prisoners had added. She found a couple lines of a Darwish poem scribbled in one book, simple drawings of flowers and trees in another, the Palestinian flag rendered in blue ink, passages underlined in red or notes made in margins. Following Zaina's lead, I did the same, searching the spaces between the printed text for the ink of men I can know no other way than by the hieroglyphics they left behind. The librarian on staff waved me over. She lifted a thick hardcover book out of her desk and opened it to reveal a secret compartment hollowed out of the center. The librarian told us prisoners had used the book to smuggle messages back and forth. Slots cut adjacent to the compartment allowed the pages to be tied together just enough so a guard could thumb through the pages without discovering the inner cavity. The hollow still contained a stash of messages written on paper peeled from the backs of cigarette foil, just as Wissam had described. The delicate paper retained a scent of tobacco. The handwriting was exceptionally precise, almost Puritan in its neatness, and nearly too tiny to read. The first Intifada prisoners, the men Bisan and Zaina so admired, starved themselves so they could read, and then swallowed and smuggled the words they'd written. In a place where ideas are forbidden, words themselves became a valuable contraband. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Marcello, for this great presentation. I think you'll have a lot of questions. I think one common theme actually between Saad on my right and Marcello on my left is actually they're not looking for heroes or villains. They're just looking for ordinary people. And I think ordinary people actually are great storytellers. I remember my grandfather, Muhammad, actually used to tell us stories all the time. He was illiterate, and he lived through the mandatory period and the Ottoman period, and he told us stories after stories. But each story, every time he told it, was slightly different. And this has actually taught me something, an awful lot about actually history and how people actually write history. That actually every time you narrate the story, it could be slightly improved on, and there's a creative imagination going on. He told us actually factual stories for him. There were true stories, absolutely happened to him. And he was there. But every time the story was slightly different. I'll move on quickly to our third distinguished speakers. I've just seen actually his 4 books. I was quite amazed by the range of authorship of Gavin Francis, actually. He's a travel writer. He's also a scientist. His books are Adventures in Human Beings, Empire Antarctica, travel writing. Some of his books were bestsellers actually. True North, another travels in Arctic Europe. It must have been very cold actually if you're traveling Arctic Europe. So, I mean, you're coming from Scotland, Gavin, so it's cold anyway. Why would you want to go to the Arctic? You would want to come to the Mediterranean, which is nice and warm. Gavin, we are so excited to have you with us tonight.
And I think Mahmoud has gone to find Ahmad because we need to restart the projector in order to make it work. It's above your head, but Mahmoud maybe knows how to do it. So what we have to do is unplug the wire, the black wire on the side, and then restart it, and then it works.
So
yeah, I like this. This health and safety. Yeah. So plug.
we have a doctor inside.
Yeah. You plug it in, and then you need to press the. Oh look, we have a new projector. Should we do that instead?
We need a minute.
Oh, okay. Right. I'm just while we're setting up the projector, I'll just explain a little bit of my background. So, yes, I live in Edinburgh, in Scotland, and when I was a little boy, I wanted to be a geographer. I wanted to make maps, and I never really left Scotland. All my holidays were there. I'd never even been in a plane until I was 18, 19. I used to spend all my time in the municipal library looking through atlases, world atlases, and dreaming of all these places I might see one day. And somewhere through the middle of my teenage years, somebody gave me, instead of giving me a geographical atlas, which is the kind I was used to, somebody gave me an atlas of anatomy, of the human body. And I was completely transfixed by this human anatomy atlas. And I decided I would not be a geographer, I would not make maps, I would instead become a doctor and learn about the geography of the body. And that took me 6 years, so I went to medical school, 6 years later, I qualified in medicine, and I did my junior internship and so on. But then, as soon as I had that qualification, this geographer reasserted itself inside me, and I began to travel. And first trips were around Europe, just with the trains, interrailing. And then after that, I began to travel wider and wider. I made a trip to East Africa, and it was kind of as a reaction to East Africa, to the heat and the great difficulties I found with the hospital there. I first went to the Arctic, so Greenland, Iceland, Lapland, and I travelled all around the Arctic, and that's what my book True North is about. And I really loved that landscape so much, I decided to go to the Antarctic, and I got a job as a doctor in the Antarctic, near the South Pole, and I lived there for 1.5 years. And then after that, I got married, and my wife and I decided to reacquaint ourselves with the diversity of the planet and the different colours and smells, and just such a wonderful richness of human cultures that exists across the planet. We would make a long trip from Scotland to New Zealand on a motorcycle. So that's what I was hoping to talk about tonight. So instead of talking about breaking boundaries of profession or talking about boundaries in Palestine, I was just going to do a very quick talk about what it's like to travel from Scotland to New Zealand through those borders. So I'm taking this breaking boundaries theme very, very literally. Now there's only 4 countries on that trip that I could not get into, and I had to find a way around. You just put start slideshow from there, Ahmad. Oh no, I don't think I have time to start there. I'll come and start it for you. So, just start slideshow. Yeah, just play from start and I'll catch up. I'll do it. Thanks. So this was the Antarctic. This was the Antarctic. 3.5 months without sunshine. But only 13 patients, but 60,000 emperor penguins. So, yes, I came back from the Antarctic, and my wife is an Arabist actually. She had been living in Beirut for this 1.5 years while I was in Antarctica. She was in Beirut. And we decided we would make this journey, starting in the Orkney Islands, which are off the north end of Scotland, so between Scotland and Norway. We started there. This is Orkney in December. And we decided to make this journey across Europe, down through France to Venice. From Venice we take a ship to Greece. We drive through Greece and Turkey. This is Istanbul, of course. And Hagia Sophia. And then from Turkey we tried at first to get a visa for Iran, but that was the first time we were turned away. So we went to Ankara, and we spent a long time in Ankara trying to get a visa for Iran, but they wouldn't give us the visa. So
can we change this to Palestine here?
Sorry, it's Google. Yeah, it's a Google map. I have to apologise. So then we had to go back to Ankara when it was clear that we were going to be refused, and apply for the visa for Syria. And through Syria, Lebanon, this is Aleppo, yeah, Aleppo, Hala, yeah. And this is Raqqa, and on the Euphrates. Yeah, and Palmyra.
That's before that.
Yeah, this is 2007. And then from Palmyra, we had to go back towards Damascus, Beirut, and down into Jordan. Now we were the next place we were refused, of course, is Saudi Arabia, because there was a plan that possibly we could drive to Dubai and take a boat to Pakistan from Dubai.
refused.
Yeah. So they refused us. So we had three options from Amman. We could either ship the motorcycle from Aqaba, we could take it by truck to Dubai, or we could fly. And these wonderful people in Amman, called Horizon Freight, I'm advertising them, Horizon Freight, they helped us, and we had to ship it to Pakistan. So I'm conscious, that's me, I've been talking for 7.5 minutes already, so I'll speed up. In Pakistan, this is the Karakoram highway up to the Chinese border, and the Chinese don't allow you to enter with a motorcycle. So we could cross to China, but we had to leave the motorcycle in Pakistan. So we did that, we left it behind, we went on the trains around China and to Tibet. This is Lhasa. And China, was a true revelation for me and the most extraordinary experience. This idea that 1.3 billion people are living this way of life which is so completely different from everywhere else on the planet. This sort of very old and the very new side by side. And we had to fly back from China to pick up the motorcycle, cross over into India. This is the border, the only open border between India and Pakistan, between Lahore and Amritsar. And then we made this trip down through Ladakh, Nepal, India, across to Southeast Asia. This is Dharamsala, where the Tibetan government in exile live. And I spent 3 months working there in the hospital, and my wife was working with these people at the Tibetan Women's Association. Then we were driving down through India. They have a law that only the driver has to wear a helmet. Down along the Ganges, the river Ganges, until eventually we reached the tip of India, where we put the motorcycle in a box in Chennai and shipped it across the Bay of Bengal. This is the Andaman Islands, which are halfway between India and Burma, because the third place we could get into is Burma, Myanmar. They don't allow you in either. We reached Thailand and drove down to Singapore. So that was the journey in Eurasia. And it was about 1 year since we left by this point. And then from Singapore we shipped the motorcycle to Perth, flew to Perth in Australia, and drove across that hot, empty country. Nobody for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of miles, just emptiness. Had to carry extra fuel. The only place we had to carry extra fuel is Australia and Ladakh, because there's no fuel stations, and camp in the bush. But very beautiful place also. And we reached Sydney eventually, and went over to New Zealand. And very strange reaching the opposite side of the planet. Essentially, New Zealand is full of Scottish people. It's like they wanted to find a climate which is as unpleasant as the climate in Scotland. So they all go to New Zealand, and you have statues of Robert Burns, who's a very famous Scottish poet. They have statues of him in New Zealand. They have shops. And we continued down to the very tip of the South Island. And this is the Southern Cross. Yeah. So that was a 10-minute run through a 18-month journey, really to introduce this idea of breaking boundaries. When we open a discussion, I have some reflections on the places that I couldn't enter Iran. When we were in Jordan, it was not possible to cross the Allenby Bridge to come into Palestine. We were not able to go to Saudi Arabia. We were not able to go to China with a motorcycle. We were not able to go to Burma. And those were the blockages that we experienced. So, thank you very much.
What incredible story you told us, Gavin. It's that kind of, it's also working in these places. It's not just traveling, it's not just enjoying yourself, but you've done a lot of things actually. And I wish I had all these places actually. I think we'll have plenty of questions for Gavin actually. We'll move on to the fourth speakers, a poet and also children writer, isn't it? You're working with children and writing for children, and you firing up their imagination.
Yes, I hope so.
May I call you?
Thank you. أنا بفضل إن أحكي بالعربي. Maybe I will give a little brief in English, but I prefer to speak in Arabic. طيب. أنا انولدت في بيروت لأب فلسطيني وأم لبنانية في 80. أبوي وأمي اتطلقوا وأنا عمري سنة. أبوي كان فلسطيني شديد فأخذنا من لبنان وحطنا في عمان. بعدين صارت حرب بيروت. هو راح إسبانيا وإحنا عشنا في عمان 10 سنين عند عمتي. طبعا ما كنت بهذاك الوقت ما بعرف كنت أمي. وبالنسبة لي كان في إشي كبير موجود في بيروت اسمه أمي يعني، وإشي كبير موجود في إسبانيا اسمه أبوي، كلياتهم كانت أصوات بالنسبة لي. وبعدين التقيت في أبوي بتونس، كانت أول مرة بشوفه. عشت معه 3 سنين، كان عمري 11 سنة. عشت معه 3 سنين في تونس. بعد هيك صارت أوسلو. رجعنا. طبعا الرجعة كانت لأبوي، بالنسبة لنا إحنا كانت عم تاخذنا من مكاننا اللي هو كان تونس أو الأردن أو بيروت، إنه هذه كانت الأماكن اللي أنا بعرفها، لكن هي فلسطين كانت المكان اللي هو أبوي بيعود إله. وبالنسبة لي هذا كان شيء كبير، لأنه كانت كل مفهوم العودة بالنسبة لي هي شيء مفروض، لأنه هو بنعود معه، هو الذي يعود ونحن المجبرين على ذلك، لأنه ما بنعرف شو فلسطين. يعني فلسطين بالنسبة لي هي كانت الانتفاضة والأطفال المرفوعين على الأكف لأنهم شيء عظيم يعني. وكان حلم حياتي أن أكون شهيدة، أكثر شيء كنت أحلم فيه أن أكون شهيدة، لأني بالنسبة لي كانت هم المرئيين الوحيدين الأطفال الشهداء. رجعت على فلسطين وعشت في نابلس. أنا أبوي من نابلس. عشت من 95 في جامعة النجاح. درست هندسة زيك. بعدين طبعا كنت في كل هاي الفترة كنت أكتب، لكن كنت أكتب أشياء بسيطة. في 2000 كنت أحب حدا واستشهد بنابلس، وحياتي بلشت الحدود فيها تصير نوع آخر تام من الحدود، لأنه دائما كانت الحدود الأخرى كانت حدود العائلة، الحدود الاجتماعية والتي تخلقها السياسة والحياة الاجتماعية. لكن باللحظة اللي مات فيها هذا الشخص اللي كنت أحبه صارت الحدود مختلفة تماما. صارت حدودي اللي أنا انخلقت معي مع المجتمع ومع الدين ومع العلاقات ومع المحرمات ومع كل شيء. كتبت أول رواية اسمها حبات السكر، وكانت بعد يمكن هذه الحد الأول اللي انكسر مع الدين، لأن أنا تحجبت لمدة 2 سنين، وضعت حجاب كامل، حجاب بيني وبين الآخرين، لأني كنت بدي أثبت إني أنا شخص جيد. وفكرة إني شخص جيد أو لا انكسرت بعد رواية حبات السكر، اللي خلصت منها من العبء الكبير اللي كنت حملته بإثبات للآخرين إنه أنا منيحة. بعد هيك انتقلت من حد نابلس إلى حد رام الله، اللي هي المدينة الواسعة الأفقية، من المدينة الحجرية العالية، المدينة الجبلية نابلس محاطة في جبالها، إلى نابلس إلى رام الله الواسعة وبأفقها. فصارت حدودي الأخرى هي حدود اللغة، الحدود المرتبطة بالثقافة، وحدود من أنا ككاتبة، من أنا كلغة. في يوم كنت معزومة كنت مطلوب مني إني أحكي عن الكاتب الفلسطيني في السويد، وبتذكر إنه أنا كنت كتير يعني غاضبة معصبه انه ليش انتم بتحكوا انه بدي اجي احكي عن الكتاب الفلسطيني. يا عمي انا مين يعني شو بنفرق احنا عن اي كاتب اخر في هذا العالم؟ انه في النهايه قصه الشخصيه او يعني قصة أي كاتب في العالم هو كاتب، إنه ليش يتم تعريفي كاتب فلسطيني، وليش الكتاب الفلسطينية بدنا نحكي عنهم كبوكس يعني. وبتذكر حكى لي شخص سويدي يعني جملة، قال لي أنا بكون مبسوط إذا إجيتي وحكيتي عن رباطك، عن رباط الحذاء تبعك. يمكن هاي كانت أكثر صدمة صدمتني في حياتي، إنه أنا كفلسطيني بقدر أحكي عن رباط حذائي. واو، يعني أنا صدمت في هذيك اللحظة. كانت يمكن أكثر شيء غير حياتي هاي الجملة، لأنها حررتني كثيرا من أعباء كانت بتقسم ظهري، أعباء الحمل الفلسطيني، حمل، ولأنه أنا كمان عندي حملين، عندي حمل شخصي اللي هي قصتي اللي كمان كانت حد كبير وفيها أهم وجدية مفرطة وشيء مزعج يعني لشخص يعيشه، وكمان كقصة كمان أدبية كتير لطيفة إنه والله يعني ينحكى عنها. وبنفس الوقت اللغة العربية الجدية اللي يمكن زي ما حكت سعاد، لما بتيجي من خلفية ثقافة عربية أنت محمل كمان بهم اللغة. ففي هذيك اللحظة بلشت أشوف العالم بطريقة أخرى، الكتابة صرت أشوفها بطريقة أخرى، وخاصة أنه بهذيك الفترة كمان صرت أشتغل مع الأطفال اللي أعطوني مساحة هائلة من الخفة والأودينس الفلسطيني. يعني صرت أشوف أكثر، أسمع أكثر مين إحنا كفلسطينية، أكثر ما نكون أنا بدي أحكي قصتي للآخر، أنا بدي أحكي قصتي لحالي. مين إحنا كجمهور فلسطيني، وإحنا شو بدنا من حالنا، يعني شو بدنا من الأدب. هذا الأدب اللي مش صحافة، الأدب مش صحافة، الأدب هو القصة اللي بتخليك تحس إنه في حدا تاني في هذا العالم بيشبهك. هون إجت لا أحد يعرف من الدمج، اللي كمان تخلصت منها من حدود الهوية، اللي كمان كانت قاتلتني إنه مين أنا، يعني بركي أنا أصلا مش فلسطينية أصلا، يعني بركي أنا مبدلة بالمستشفى، ويعني أنا لبنانية، وكنت كتير يعني مبسوطة إني أعيش إنه أسأل نفسي هذا السؤال الكبير، إنه كهوية مين أنا كهوية. وبعد لا أحد يعرف زبرة دمها كمان الكل تعامل معها فقط بمنظور الهوية، وصارت ما صرنا نحكي فقط إنه الهوية، إثبات الهوية، وكل هاي الرحلة المرعبة بإثبات مين أنت ومين هويتك كفلسطيني. دخلت في مرحلة أخرى تماما، وهي جليتر، اللي هي حكاية الشخصيات التي ليس لها حكاية أصلا، وهي الشخصيات التي تملأ الدنيا الفلسطينية، إنهم من الناس اللي هم حتى مش موجودين أصلا ضمن حكاية، ومهما كانت غير عادية، يعني هم ليس لهم أي حكاية أصلا. وفي رواية جليتر حسيت حالي حرة تماما من هذا الثقل، لكن بكل هاي الكسر لهاي الحدود، خلينا نقول يعني نسيت شو بدي احكي. يعني هي يمكن علمني هذا الاشياء هاي كلياتها، علمتني شغله انه الحدود دائما موجوده بالنقطه اللي انت تنظر لها. اذا كنت زي انا هلا عايشه في القدس، انا بالنسبه لي حاجزي الكبير هو قلمبيا. لما كنت عايشه في نابلس كانت حاجزي الكبير هو المجتمع. لما يكون حدا في السجن حاجزه الكبير هو السجن. في كل مكان انت عندك حاجزك الذي عليك ان تتخطاه. وحكايتك الشخصيه اصعب الحواجز، لانها اكثر الحواجز اللي بتحتاج منك لشغل لتتخطاها. وهون الادب حلو كتير ومتعب كتير وبنفس الوقت مفيد كتير يمكن فقط. اوكي
ما شكرا. اوكي خلينا ترجمة تلغرافيا. ستي سبعة فهموهاش. Okay. Telegraphically, Maya was born in Beirut. Okay, sorry. She moved to Tunis with the PLO in 1982 after the Israeli invasion of Lebanon. She came back with Palestine with Arafat to after the Oslo Agreement. Her father is from Nablus. They came back to Nablus. Maya studied in Najaf University. At one point, she fell in love with someone who was murdered, became shaheed, assassinated or killed by the Israelis. A shock, a personal shock, a trauma. She talks about actually her putting on the Islamic hijab, strict hijab for 2 years. She talks about various different barriers actually she went through, and the struggle between the collective identity she came across and the personal identity, and how these identities actually come constantly kind of in conflict with each other. And then she moved on to talk about working with children, how working with children actually freed her, how children stories, narrating, working with them was a way of actually freedom, discovering freedom, and also the way she constructed things. She began to construct her own identities, and she says something about actually barriers is actually partly our perspectives. Our perspectives on things actually will impact on the way we construct barriers. In fact, actually, if we live in East Jerusalem, we imagine barriers differently if we live here. So there are many barriers to overcome, and individuals actually play a big role in overcoming these barriers. I don't think I've been very fair to you, but maybe just a bit. And Saad is going to comment on it to begin with. You want to start the debate with comment?
Yeah. Actually, thank you very much, Maya. I really enjoyed your personal presentation, and this is the point I was trying to make at the very beginning. I want to start with the shoelace, ribat al-hida. I think this is a life-changing experience. I understand why, but I want to talk with the audience a little bit more. One thing I noticed as a Palestinian writer, actually, and this is the point I started with, which is the collective story versus the personal story. ما بعرف ليش احنا بنستحي نحكي الشيء الخاص، يعني دائما بنهرب للشيء العام. Or by running away to the collective story, really we lose the texture of what happened to us in Palestine. يعني أنا لما حكيت إنه شو يعني الواحد بيخسر بلد? How does a reader relate to you losing a country? Well, if I told you that I come from Jaffa, my father had a house in Jaffa, and you know the grandmother never recovered. She always wanted her bedroom. My father was very sad because he left the photograph of his mother. And actually when he came back to Jaffa, to his house, all he wanted from the Israeli family who was living there is to get his mother's photo that was sitting on that wall, and the lady refused to give it to him. What I'm trying to say is that somehow we Palestinians shy away from our personal stories. And I think that people get more tied to us or understand us if I say that, my sisters actually, when they left, my family left from Jerusalem, she kept talking about the 2 dogs that she left behind as a little kid for 2 years. We lost, a garden, we lost a school, we lost a hospital, we lost a bedroom, a kitchen, a piano, a book, a living room, and we tend to forget all of these things. And that's why I was very touched with the shoelace. And I want to know more about your mother, by the way. You never told us what... Yeah. Okay.
No, actually...
You can respond.
Because I will read it. I
forget what I was saying. My mother is Lebanese, actually. She's still. I know her when I became like 20 years old. This was like the first meeting in Jordan. She's still in Lebanon, and my father. I came back with my father here, and actually after I finished with this story, I finished with motherhood also, because also when I became a mother, it was like I became having this big idea about being a mother, about a mother, because I never had a mother, so I was like having this idealist idea about it. But when I became a mother, I also break this boundaries, because it's also like a very اجتماعي يعني it's a social idea, it's a very romantic idea about being a mother and raising children, and the truth is I can understand what is happening with my mother later, although I'm not sympathizing with her, but I can understand it from a different perspective, because I also it's all about where are you now? Where are you? I really maybe it's not just experience; it's also the old how the age maybe yeah.
Okay, Maya. I actually love. I'm a professional historian, and all my life academic actually. But I love personal history. When someone actually starts telling me their personal history, I listen more to them than when someone talks about, Erdogan in Turkey. So actually, these personal histories, actually, in fact, what you're doing, they're incredibly exciting. They're incredibly important, and I think we do actually pay an awful lot of attention to them in oral history. Because I did talk a lot last night, about my new book, Palestine: 4,000-Year History. Palestine, Tarikh 4,000 سنة. I talked about it a lot last night, so I'm not going to repeat it. I'm just going to say the book is outside to look at it. And this morning I also ran a workshop at the Najah University on the oral history of the Nakba. Again, we have an awful lot of personal history here, actually, in oral history, and we are also our story. I think I'm also a storyteller, but I'm going to shut up here and allow the audience actually to have its say. And يعني ممكن تحكوا بالعربي إذا بدكم، ممكن توجهوا أسئلة خاصة لسعاد، لجافن، لماتشيرو، لمايا، وممكن تكون تعقيب يعني you can comment, you can ask specific questions if you do want to address a particular person. And please, it's all open. Shall we start from here? And then we'll go to second to Nasab, and then we'll go to third here, this corner, and we'll come to that corner. 1, 2, 3, okay? اتفضل توفيق.
المايك توفيق.
بدك المايك؟ Okay.
Thank you for your presentation. It's fascinating, very interesting, and there's a lot of talk between different panelists there. I want to challenge parts of the way it's come off and it's been framed, and particularly, most succinctly, probably by Saad, to be honest, the tensions that exist between the collective versus the individual narration. And I mean, parts of me, I'm a political economist, and so when you take a step back at what happens, a lot of what's happening here is taking place in the context of great failures of the Palestinian project, great attempts to try and understand what went wrong, and a feeling that the bigger project, the dreams, the romantic visions of what we were trying to do and say we were doing in the name of the collective, either were false or they failed. We don't know whether they were false. There certainly isn't a narrative that is saying, oh, they were false. Perhaps they were, perhaps they weren't. I don't know. On the other hand, there is a movement, which we see on stage today, tending towards the individual, entering the individual. And I understand this as well, because we can relate to each other, whatever. But parts of me have tension with framing of the individual as though it's fully also emancipatory end in and of itself. Can you speak to the tensions between the collective and the individual? Because the individual does it lead to collective goals, or does it lead to individual ends in the end? And what is the role for the collective in the end? The historian, the one who wants to talk about more collective things. Thank you.
We'll take 2-3 questions, and then we'll come to Saad. Okay. Nessa.
What is gained and what is lost?
Absolutely. You asked a number of big questions. Yeah.
Thank you. And my question is to Gavin. I want to ask if you find a connection between the maps of the body and the maps of the world. So if you connect, for example, one country to one organ in the body or something like that.
Okay, we'll come back to you, Gavin. The third question, and then we'll have the answers. Okay, just behind, yes. Tfadali.
I just want to say thank you for this amazing evening. I just enjoyed this diversity in the room and in the table. I've never wanted to be a motorcycle in my life as much as now, you know. My question is in general for all of you, like, what is the first poem or first book that you've read and you said, oh my god, I want to write like that, or I want to become a writer? And did you feel like I could do this, or were like times, this is so bad? Yeah. And thank you all.
Wonderful, thank you. Okay, so let's actually start with Saad, and then we'll go to Gavin and Monshe.
Okay, I will address Tawfiq's question. Listen, Tawfiq, I am a PLO generation. So, a PLO generation, meaning I was an activist in the 70s, and the collective was extremely important. I mean, even if whoever criticizes Arafat for all their good, bad reasons, he has done one good thing, which is the collective story. I remember being a refugee in Amman, not knowing whether I was a Palestinian, Jordanian, my identity, my mom is Syrian, and my identity is totally at loss, so I do understand the importance of the collective story, which the political movements, all the political movements really put us together. And we should never underestimate, even I always talk to younger generation, that when you criticize the Sulta today, you have all the reasons to criticize it, but you have to realize the role of the PLO in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. They are the ones who made someone in Chile or Canada or India or in Jordan stand up and say, I am a Palestinian, and I am not shy to say it. I'm proud to be a Palestinian, not that I am a nationalist, but at least that identity. So I am totally for the collective story in a sense, but I think that it's like a political party. It's like what we call it, rasm al-iltizami, like when you, after a while, this collective story becomes exactly addressed. It becomes a prison. And then we keep repeating ourselves, and we do not deconstruct Palestine. Because what is it that we lost? We lost our homes. And we never found the home again. It's not that I lost Palestine, I lost my home, my neighbors, my street, my shop, my father was not talking about, my grandmother was not talking about Palestine. My father was talking about, he used to put the manshef on his shoulder and cross the road and go and swim in the sea. That's what he missed most. So I think sometimes the collective make us lose. Okay, 750,000 Palestinians were kicked out of their homeland. شرفنا طيب وبعدين. But if you take one person and go and tell the story, then you have a name and you have a description for that person. In my book, Golda Slept Here, you know that there is a woman called Huda al-Imam who lost her home. People know who Huda is. We know which house is. We know which Israeli family is living in that house. The personal story has a strength that leads to the collective. And sometimes it's more powerful to tell a personal story to get to the collective. And we are all obsessed with the collective, unfortunately.
This is literature. We are writing literature. At the end, we are writing literature. And literature is not, it's not information. It's not information, it's knowledge, At the end, you don't want to underestimate your values as a writer also. This is very important, actually, and very critical to me as a writer, I don't want you to expect me to tell you very like sadness Palestinian. I will tell you this sadness story, but I will telling you you that by make you laugh. This is a way also to make you feel more, and less tragedy. But at the same time, it is It is a tragedy. Like, if you talk about water in Palestine, if you talk about streets in Palestine, everything is politics at the end, but you have to put this politics in literature way, يعني, at the end.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm not going to actually theorize about collective and personal, but I do think actually there's a personal self-determination, the way Noor acts and reacts and being creative and try to present himself. I actually write books partly to other people, but partly for myself actually, but partly to explain things to myself. An awful lot of things actually I didn't know without writing this book about Palestine 4,000-year history. There's an awful lot of personal history in the way we write collective history or social history, but I see your point and I see the tension and I can see this debate going on, and this is an important thing. What I will go to is actually to Gavin about the question addressed to you.
So the question about the concordances or the relationships between the physical map of the body and the geographical map of the world, I think there's a lot of similarities, but they're not obviously direct. The first thing that hit me when I was a kid was the aesthetic similarity. You know, these blue rivers and yellow roads and red roads were aesthetic. There was a similarity to the fact that they were mapping these different spaces, the body, in nerves, arteries and veins and so on. But that's, of course, only the most superficial way they're similar. The real way they're similar is they both take something which is inconceivably complex, which is either the world around us or the human body, and they make it simple, they make it comprehensible, they make it something you can master. You feel that when you've read the whole book and you've learned everything in it, you now know something. And that's the way in which mapping the body and mapping the geography can be similar. And I also think that, you know, my first two books were travel books, and a travel writer goes to a country, describes the place, describes the landscape, talks about the history, has some encounters, talks about the culture. And when I write my books about medicine, I do exactly the same thing. I just move around an anatomical landscape, but I talk about encounters I have with people that have problems. I talk about the history and the culture and the ideas behind that part of the body. And very briefly, your question about how to become a writer or what inspires you to become a writer. There's an absolutely wonderful American nature writer called Annie Dillard. I don't know if you've ever come across her. She's just tremendous. She's still alive and not writing so much now. And she has a great line in one of her books where she was trying to teach a writing class. And she relates this story of a friend of hers who was a painter. And she said, "Why are you a painter? What inspired you to become a painter?" And this person replied, "I love the smell of paint." And so this person loved to be working with paint, and that was the reason they were a painter. And her answer to a student who comes to her and says, "Should I be a writer? I want to be a writer. I think I want to be a writer." And she says, "Well, do you like sentences? Do you like the act of sitting and crafting a beautiful sentence that will convey what you want to do, what you want to say in an elegant way, but a concise way?" And I think that's the best possible kind of description of what as a writer you're trying to do. You have this image, this idea, and you want to communicate it, and you have to do it elegantly, beautifully, but concisely. And so she's a good person to start with, I would say.
Brilliant. There was a question about poetry and poem, and what's your favourite poem, isn't it? That question. Yeah. Yesterday we had Nessa, the great poet here, and I think Marcello actually also, his book actually is taken from in line from Mahmoud Darwish, and Marcello, I would like to hear your commentary on that.
The idea of, you know, I don't know if I remember the first book that inspired me to become a writer. I think I wonder if that's even a thing. I think those of us who become writers are those of us who read voraciously and ate up the books in the libraries and went through them. I think what makes us different, what makes writers not normal people, is that when we read Dillard or whoever our favorite writers are, we read them once and love it, and then we read it again to figure out how did she do that. Yeah. It's about unlocking figuring out the alchemy that's there. For me that's Joan Didion. But I have not figured it out. I'll go back to the same stories, the same books all the time, and try to unlock it, and still haven't. And people ask, I think maybe yes. I think you ask, how did you know when you got there? And I haven't. I think every time I publish another book or something, I feel like I've put one on. I've tricked someone. So I think it's something that you never reach that point, because you're always trying to be the best writer you've read, and you never get there. And if you think you got there, you probably haven't.
Just one point about the issue of poetry. I first picked up actually Mahmoud Darwish's poetry when I was a teenager and a student at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem in the 70s, and we kind of memorized all these poems, Sajilana Arabi, kada kada. I think since then I've kind of been in constant dialogue with Mahmoud Darwish, and also I discovered that he was in dialogue with himself. And there's that kind of dialogue between the private and the public constantly going on, and between the individual and the collective. I mean, these dialogue will continue forever, by the way, between us. These are not two separate planets, by the way. And this is perhaps an answer to you, that, when I write a history, professional history, a people's history, I'm constantly in dialogue with that history. I'm in dialogue with books written by, with Khalil Sakakini, his approach, I think we need to be constantly in dialogue with ourselves, and also with our people, with our writers, with our intellectuals, also with ordinary people, I constantly go back to what my grandparents were telling us about the Nablus period, what my father. Sometimes I discover things by actually kind of going in my mind. So this constant dialogue between us and the society is one way to break these boundaries. And I'll just go to Maya if you want to comment on any particular thing, any poem.
يعني أنا بدي أحكي إنه يمكن الكاتب بضل يشتغل دائما على إنه يتحسس وين أي حدود بيقدر يقطعها، سواء مع السلطة، سواء مع نفسه، سواء مع العائلة، مع كل هاي مع الاحتلال، ومع اللغة. كتير مهم كمان مع اللغة، لأنه اللغة هي خاصة اللغة العربية. اللغة العربية مرعبة، يعني لأنه في لها تاريخ طويل، وإلها تاريخ ديني، وإلها تاريخ تحسس. هيدي بتضلك تحاول تخطى حدودك لتوصل للنقطة اللي أنت بتحتاجها. يمكن أنا من الكتب المفضلة، يعني أول كتاب قرأته وهو أعطاني صوت كروائية، هو كتاب اسمه حكاية زهرة للشيخ حنان الشيخ. حسيت إنه يخرب بيتك كيف تكتب، أنا بدي أكتب. إنه بالضبط كان هذا شعوري، يعني لما قرأت حنان الشيخ.
Okay, أسئلة من هاي الناحية. مين اللي رفعه؟ Okay, well, let's go for you.
I have one question for you, Marcello, and that is, I'd like you to comment, if you can, upon the degree to which you think literature in Palestine has been perhaps weaponized or not in the struggle for liberation, or instrumentalized, so it's a better term.
Weaponized? That's a good question.
When I was doing the research for the book, there was people kept telling me the same sort of thing, a change that happened in the history of Palestinian literature, where up until Oslo, writers, artists of all kinds, but writers in particular, were really kind of waving the flag and writing politics on the page. Every woman in a poem represented the mother Palestine. Every red flower was the blood of the martyrs, and this kind of stuff. And then after Oslo, they realized all the efforts they put in had come to naught. Then things completely changed, and we had what we were talking about here, where we go from that collective project to the individual one. Not an abandonment of the idea of Palestine, but a turning inwards to find the stories that are there within people. For the weaponizing of it, the writers that let's see if I get into trouble with this one. The writers that I most admired, and the ones that I included in this book, are not wielding their poems as weapons. They're creating art on the page. That is their primary purpose. There are poets who write sloganeering poems. and stories that are meant to rouse. I find that less artful than the writers like Maya, who I had the opportunity to write about, and others who are first artists and not soldiers. There's enough soldier talk about this part of the world, so I really wanted to talk to the poets who are poets first, the writers who are writers first, and that was my focus. So I don't know if I have a good answer for you. I'm less interested in those kinds of writers than I am writers like Maya.
Go ahead.
I want to tell you a story I wrote once called Kharandia. It's half shit, half Qalandia. Okay, Kharandia. So it's about couples who usually go to every day they go through Qalandia because they work in Ramallah and they live in Jerusalem. And each time they stop at Qalandia, their daughter do it. Like she has a big shit every time. So they start fighting all the time on Qalandia. You are a bad mother. You never have diapers in your bags. You put me in Jerusalem. I live in Jerusalem because of you. All this big fight. It happened at Qalandia, and this very tension. And then they cross it after they give the soldier the IDs, one green and one blue, and they go home normally. But what is really happened, and this is what happened in all our life in Palestine, that we are occupied here. We are mentally occupied. Why? Because we think about Qalandia 1 hour before we go to Qalandia. We think about Qalandia after 1 hour we cross Qalandia. We are thinking about, like now, I am afraid that I will say a word and then they will not give me a residency for the next year. This is what's called incubation. And when you talk about this and when you talk about it as Kharandia, this is very funny and people will, like audience will have it, but at the same time, it is very sad and it's very true and it's happened, you know. I will tell you the rest of the story later because it's very funny.
Let's have more questions from the audience. This side we haven't had. Fadl.
Alright, so I think it's useful for me to say that I'm from South Africa because what I'm going to say after that just like follows. Firstly, it's really refreshing to hear so many personal stories coming out from a place that's supposed to have all these political stories and stories that are just like woven with conflict all the time. Because I think in South Africa we have the same problem, even in like a post-apartheid South Africa where you have, you know, people constantly criticized for not bringing up the political too much or for not bringing up the personal too much. And so I admire you for breaking that boundary and trying to get to the personal in such, you know, times. I don't know, I'm not articulating myself properly. So thank you so much. The other thing that I think I'm really interested in knowing is this whole idea of like an oral history. And since we have like both writers, fiction writers and a historian here, you know, like the oral history as sort of like a personal story, which we are very much exposed to also in the South African context and which we're trying to revisit, to rewrite the historical narrative. So I think I'm not so much like interested in, you know, what's more important, this collective story or this individual story, but rather how much this personal story or this individual story can actually alter a historical narrative. Yeah, and just like another thing, I don't know if it's going to be a question or a statement, but I think just being in Palestine and being here for quite some time and realizing that Palestine is not, you know, just this place that's like, you know, full of conflict and what you see on the news. It's like a living, thriving society and people have to live through it every day and they're creating art every day and they have ordinary stories every day. And sometimes I think that like when you're too fixated on like providing a narrative that the world wants to see or that aligns with the news, you somehow lose an entire literary culture because you're so obsessed with, you know, the politics or like the history of a place. So yeah, I don't know what my question is, but those are just my thoughts. Thank you so much.
No, I think that's a brilliant point. Just to contextualize a bit actually, I mean we had yesterday, last night, and it was a brilliant panel, and I think Nessa talked a lot about actually how we need to allow women to grieve and not to just celebrate when their children die. You know, give the personal, give the human side of things, and humanize things. Another thing, tomorrow, just to link yesterday with today and tomorrow we'll have a great panel in Ramallah with Salim Tamari about the personal and the political. So this is actually a continuous dialogue between yesterday, today, and tomorrow. And the dialogue is between us and you. We are not coming to lecture you, by the way. We need to have this constant dialogue, and we need to encourage that dialogue within our society to continue. It's not just one-off thing. So I'm just hoping this week will be. Let's have more questions, actually, from the audience. Please.
I'm a visitor to Palestine, and I love coming. And I go home, and I talk to people. And it's really just to say, I have to take individual stories home, because we have a media story in the UK, which everybody knows, which I guess is a collective, which is totally what I don't feel when I come to Palestine. So actually the individual stories are the really important thing for me to take home with me, to tell people, and hopefully that way I can then build a different collective about Palestine in the UK, which is where I'm from. So it's really just to say, perhaps turning it a little bit on its head. It's not really a question, but I love hearing the individual stories.
Well, thank you for
and I hope that my audience at home do too.
Well, thank you for coming here also. We're delighted to have you here. Let's have more questions from the audience. Further.
Yeah, I'm an English student here at Nablus University, and I'm really passionate about creative writing and free verse poetry in particular. So I have a question about whether you think creative writing should be limited to the environment the writer has lived in, or does imagination, or is imagination an essential part of literature? So, because when I write, I don't write everything from my personal experience. Sometimes I write things that I've never experienced, but I just imagine how it feels. And another question is self-criticism when you're writing. It's really hard to write a poem and not want to delete it. Right after. So I want to know what you think about whether is this like a normal thing, or is it?
Two brilliant questions. Marcello, and then Saad, if you wish to respond. Yeah.
I think that the impulse of a writer to immediately delete what he or she writes is the correct one. Not to say you should do that, but the impulse is correct. I think we're always wanting to. The minute we're super satisfied with what we put on the page is the minute we've done something terribly wrong. Your first question, writing other people's stories. I come from Canada, and we talk a lot, especially in the last few years, about the idea of appropriation, especially when telling stories about Canada's Indigenous people, when non-Indigenous people are writing Indigenous stories, and it's there's caution to be exercised there, for sure. There's an idea of stealing something from people who have had things stolen from them constantly, which sometimes people ask me about why I'm writing about Palestine. They could say the same thing. They could approach me with that same question. That all said, I think if we are writers and creators, the world is open to us as long as we are empathetic and write with love about people that we're not.
Saad, do you wish to respond to this point?
I want to. Okay, you have. I don't think there is a cliche for whether to write about yourself or imagination. Some writers are good actually in imagining things, and you obviously have a lot of imagination, and I am jealous from you. Yeah, some people like me, I am best telling something that I saw with my own eyes. So I think go for it, go for the imagination, and don't ask us, do whatever you feel like, really. You will be just be yourself. I just want to go back to the personal again, South Africa, and all of us who have talked about the personal. And Tawfiq, I think that part of the problem that we forget is the trauma. Palestinians, I think, were not ready to tell the personal stories for many generations, and it's coming out now because of the distance with it. I am surprised how little when I wrote Golgaslet here, which is about people, Palestinian, visiting their own homes with Israeli families in it, I was surprised that I did not know my story. I did not know why, how my parents left. I wasn't even sure whether they left from Jerusalem or from Jaffa. No, from Jerusalem. The dining table in Amman that I lived all my life eating on that table had bullets in it. I didn't even notice. Nobody even mentioned to me that my father was away, my mother had to move things, she came back to her house, she carried my two sisters who are older than me to Damascus, came back to find out that the Jewish militia had occupied her house, and then she had to share it with them, and they divided the house. They said, if you want to stay, you stay here, but meanwhile they're fighters inside the house, so my father couldn't arrive. So she had to move the house. They took half of the furniture and the two dogs that my sisters were. When I wrote the book at the age of 60, I did not know the story. I had to talk to my eldest sister, my aunts, and then I asked, how come I don't know these things? And you will be surprised how many Palestinian parents have not told their family what happened to them. They were traumatized, they were shy, they were humiliated, so they didn't want to say there has been rapes, there has been massacres. I am now writing something on Jaffa, and I am shocked how little I know about Lud and Jaffa. I consider myself a I have lived all my life as a political activist. I didn't know. People who were raped in the Arab world never tell you that our daughter was raped. Nobody tells you that, when did we hear about the massacre in Lud? How many of us know? I am shocked how much they did not share with us. And only now we're coming to terms to tell those stories. My father, when he visited his house, he came back, he was depressed. He didn't even tell us what he saw, except that the people refused to give him the photo of his. So there is a lot of trauma in it, and that's why I think it was never shared with us.
Why do you think it's being shared now? What's changed? Is it just time that's passed?
I think it's time, and we are curious because, I did not go through the trauma. I wasn't born. So for me, it's more intellectual, and you start reading, and then when you want to know, then you start asking. But when we were little, and also they were trying to protect us. Refugees want to assimilate. My father wanted to be in Jordan for a long time. I didn't know whether I was Jordanian or Palestinian. They want to protect you, so they don't tell you all the trauma that they went through. They just keep quiet.
Let me relate to the issue of creative writing to the historian, to oral history. There was a question about oral history, and there's a new book about oral history, written by about 10 Palestinian oral historians, some from Lebanon, some Rosemary Sy, us. So fact and fiction, i.e., let's say the story of Hassan Kanfani, actually, Men in the Sun, Rijal fi Shams. Is it fact or is it fiction? The story is the real story. It's actually based on real fact. The ending is fictional because we know that these men actually did survive and ended up in Kuwait. And he actually killed them. He decided to kill them. We know that from talking to him. And so there's a lot of facts in Hassan Kanfani's fiction. There are a lot of facts in Mahmoud Darwish's poetry. So I think that sharp division between fact and fiction in the way people tell stories. My mother, grandma used to tell us a lot of stories. So I think we need to widen the definition of storytelling identity of oral history, of our oral history, and to say that our oral history comes not just from professional historians like me and Rosemary Side on this and that, also, but it comes from a whole range of storytellers, from the Hakawatis, from our traditional ways of seeing things, and from our novels, from our writers. I mean, you are also storytellers. I mean, you are also a historian, if you like, historic. I think historic is one way to not just articulate individual narrative, actually, but to tell your stories. I mean, we need to tell our stories, whether individually or collectively, as a people, and I'm afraid we need to keep doing that. And whether we do it in fiction, or we do it in poetry, or we do it academically, we feel the need to tell our story. I mean, partly because of our plight and very tough situation. So, we tell the story constantly and constantly. But also we tell it ourselves, we tell it to our children. We move from one generation to another generation. That's ought to be in a pluralistic way, in a kind of accepting multiple narratives, accepting different stories, accepting the fact that experiences are different, our experiences are different, but also connecting these experiences. I think this is one way. I mean, just to go back to Tufik, because I think Tufik actually did poke us a bit, and I like this idea, because I actually think there are plenty of connection between these individual stories, actually, although they don't have to have a grand narrative or collective narrative or a nationalist kind of sloganeering narrative. In fact, we Palestinians have an awful lot of connections, even without you being born, me being born in Italy, you being born in Lebanon, in fact. So I think this is what brings us together, is interconnectedness. And this is what actually makes this festival so exciting. And also, by the way, our interconnectedness is also with our guests actually here. I mean, we are part of a much wider world of togetherness, in fact. I mean, Palestine is not on its own. We need to be open to the rest of the world. You mentioned but also, there are, we need to tell stories of other people. We need to invite other people to tell the stories. So I think this constant interaction between us and the rest of the world will be the way we need to move forward with Palestine, by the way.
I don't know if it's right or not, but I have this idea that about history and novel, because history is always written by somebody who has the authority to write it. It's not supposed to be the power, like having the authority, but also as organization or somebody to give you a commission to write this kind of history, that line of history. But as a novel is totally different. It's like I have no intention to give a certain way or line to. I give you the story of people who has no stories in life that is very they are under this big story of the histories that telling by the history. I don't know. This is
that's a good point. Let's have more questions, and we're going to end up this session fairly soon. I'm afraid it's been a long day for us. Actually, anyone kind of wish to have a few comments? Let's have two comments from this side.
I just have a comment about Madame Saad. I just like the fact, and Mr. Hussein, I don't know how you pronounce that, sorry.
Me.
Yeah, you're I like the fact that you both are trying to be realistic in your writings. You like, whenever I read a book, there's this supernatural character that I feel close to it, but not too close. I mean, I can't do that. I mean, like, at the end of the day, I close the book and I say, I can't do that. But when you say a realistic character like this, it just makes me feel like it's more real to me. Like, I can do this. This is realistic. I can do this. It's not out of my power. So I like this way of literature, and I think I'll definitely go and read, even though I have tests. Like, yeah.
Both very inspiring, yeah. Next.
I just have one more question about inspiration. Because as writers, Saad said that she doesn't believe in inspiration, but what about others? Because I personally think sometimes write something and right afterwards.
Inspiration or perspiration?
I will give you like inspiration, but from you. يعني. I will give you an exercise, writing exercise. You will do it at home. Put a big paper at the earth, and somebody like drawing your shape of body, and divide this shape into years. How old are you?
18.
80. So put 18 lines. And try to put simple or anything that you remember from like when you were 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, until 18 years, and then try to link this to something happened outside from, like in the world. Like when you were 6, there was like a Gulf War, or when you maybe at 10 there was like Intifada. And then try to see this image, and that would be a great story for you to start with. This is inspiration, but this inspiration is from you, from your life, from you know. So it can happen anyway. Like I always write through when I go through Qalandia to Jerusalem to Ramallah. I always like write stories and have like because it's happened everywhere. Stories is in streets. Now you can go home and write something maybe about you hating yourself sitting at that chair and this crazy woman that was writing. You know, it's everywhere. I'm the crazy, not she, of course. I love that. So yeah, it's everywhere. Inspiration is everywhere. But it's not coming from the sky. It's coming from here. It's material. It's very realistic.
Okay. Telegraphically short comments. Gavin, is it inspiration or perspiration for you?
Yeah, definitely a little bit of both. I mean, you can't write unless you enjoy the process of sitting down there hour after hour, hour after hour, and putting in the work of the sentences which you're trying to make encapsulate what you want. And I think when you find a subject, there's little subjects are coming through all the time, like shooting stars. Little ideas are coming through your mind, and you might write them down. And when one of them just catches, it ignites. It's a little bit like falling in love. You become like all you want to think about is that idea. That idea is the one that catches fire. That's the one which just keeps you going back to the writing table with joy, and you look forward to it. And that's what I think you need to look for.
Inspiration or perspiration?
Certainly more perspiration. I can tell a very, very quick story about the great Canadian novelist who, when he would go into his room at the same time every day and just clatter on his typewriter until the same time every day, just every single day the same. And his roommate came up to him once and said, how is it that you get inspired at exactly the same time every morning? And he said, if I waited to get inspired, I wouldn't write a goddamn thing.
Okay, so have you changed your mind about inspiration?
I'm very stubborn, more stubborn than you think, but I need to explain myself actually. Writing process for me is fascinating, and the inspiration only happens while I am writing. It means like I sit down to write that I saw you and you're wearing black and you're interesting and imaginative. I sit down and then I end up telling a story about imagining who your family is, and it has nothing to do with what I wanted to start with. I find that sitting down and writing, within that hour, from 6 to 6 or 6 to 8, whatever, as if it's something like the amoeba. Here we have a doctor, that keeps splitting. This is what I love about it. That's why I don't say it's inspiration in the meaning, okay, maybe I'm sitting here or Qalandia or there and I say, okay, Murad was actually a character that I wrote about who came to work with me in a garden. That is the beginning of a story. So that you could call that inspiration. But that inspiration will not be a book if I don't sit down and wrote about it. And the process itself is not like the story. Really, I don't know the story. I only know that there is Murad and that person inspired. But everything else comes while writing. As you are sitting writing, that's where the inspiration happens.
Absolutely.
This is how I feel about it.
I also agree with that. I mean, just one word about my book, for Palestine, 4,000 Years of History. This was 10% inspiration and 90% perspiration, hard work, or it's really hard work. So I think 90% hard work, 10% inspiration. I think it works for me this way. And thank you so much. شكرا جزيلا للجميع. For the brilliant speakers here, really distinguished authors, but also incredibly inspiring. This is inspiration for me, just to hear Zahra. That's an inspiration. And to hear Marcello and Gavin and Maya. And hope to see you again, if you can make it to Ramallah tomorrow. Another panel in the evening.